Kids are silly, aren't they? Yeah. I'm still thinking about when we voted as kids. Not in a million years would we have won. Even our own ballots were spelled wrong. We couldn't even agree on who should be king or queen. Kris has been my neighbor forever. We've been through so much. Sometimes it feels like we know each other better than anyone. Yet, somehow, it's hard to say we're exactly friends.
Kinda like riding a Ferris wheel together.
Yeah, it was kinda just, forced.
Before I knew you, I kinda thought you and Noelle were a thing.
Even so, I still cried my eyes out that we lost. And so you told me, let's ride the Ferris wheel. And then when we got on, you just shook it, over and over and over again.
And I know that's not true, right? I mean, she likes me.
Now that I think about it, that made me stop crying, didn't it?
So why does she have to talk to you?
But Kris, you changed.
Why can't either of you tell me what it's about?
Kris, you actually changed!
Throughout the game, we're constantly given mixed signals about what Kris and Noelle's relationship is actually meant to represent. Every new interaction seems to add another layer, and for a long time I genuinely wasn't sure of what Toby Fox was trying to communicate. In my last video, I briefly shared my thoughts about them, but I left out a lot of important information. Part of that was because I wasn't sure how to explain everything with the context it deserved. Especially knowing how people can be divided on this topic. It's honestly been one of the hardest parts of Deltarune for me to talk about, because no matter how carefully you approach it, there is always the risk of misinterpreting it. But I want to talk about it anyways, even if it does end up being controversial. The subtext of Kris and Noelle has already made it clear enough that there's something between them. And I mean closer to romance than anything. It's not something we can just brush aside anymore. And after having to dig deeper and read through the comments on my last video, I've been thinking about it a lot. So I want to approach this subject with a lot of maturity and respect for these characters as people than just for us to theorize about. I don't fully agree with the opposite interpretation of the idea that it should only be viewed through a broader lens while completely overlooking the romantic subtext. I think both readings are missing something because the relationship is much more complicated than either side gives it credit for. And it's not just because of the weird root. If you think this video is going to be just about that, it isn't. We already know by now that Kris and Noelle used to be childhood friends. They share a history that's deeply tied to one of Deltarune's biggest mysteries after all. Des has always been an important part of both Kris and Noelle's relationship because the two of them spent so much time together with Asriel, exploring the forest and growing up alongside each other. Even if we don't fully get context of how they felt about one another, it's obvious they were incredibly close back then. Noelle, however, tends to downplay just how close they actually were. Even when talking about her childhood, she often frames Kris as someone distant or difficult to understand, which makes sense given Kris's quiet nature. In fact, I think it changes the way we're supposed to read almost everything Noelle tells us about Kris, because she's an unreliable narrator when it comes to her own emotions. Her memories are filtered through grief and nostalgia, making it difficult for her to separate what she believes happened from what Kris may have actually felt. The result is that Kris and Noelle often seem like they're remembering the same relationship from completely different perspectives. One example of this is the Ferris wheel conversation. While talking to Susie in Chapter 4, Noelle describes how she and Kris ended up riding the Ferris wheel together, almost framing it as though they were unwilling to ride it. But Chapter 5 completely changes the context. In the festival, if you go through the booth of voting for King and Queen, you can earn unique dialogue if you choose for both you and Noelle, and interactions through the festival triggers an old memory of hers. When Noelle reminisces about competing with Des and Asriel to become the festival's King and Queen, she admits she was genuinely upset after losing, admitting that she was crying. And what does Kris do? Instead of leaving her alone or treating it like a joke, Kris goes out of their way to cheer her up. They shake the Ferris wheel and do everything they can to make her laugh and pull her out of that moment. That's a very different picture from the one Noelle originally paints. They actively chose to comfort Noelle when she was at her lowest, and I think that completely changes how we're supposed to read that memory. That's not indifference. In fact, almost every dialogue option surrounding Noelle gives a little more insight into how she actually felt about Kris. What's surprising is, she doesn't talk about those memories with embarrassment or discomfort. If anything, her nostalgia gives her more of an impact than she does with living in the moment with Susie. What's even more interesting is that after being reminded, Noelle decides to go alongside it without feeling hurt, to vote for herself and Kris instead of herself and Susie like in the original. That moment says a lot. being reminded of Kris's kindness, of how those kids still deserve to win. Beneath their present-day relationship, we learn that Kris constantly played pranks on Noelle when they were kids. That detail is more important than it first appears because it tells us what Kris used to be like before the events of the game. For the longest time, this was one of our biggest windows into Kris as a character. Noelle's stories have always been one of the clearest descriptions of who Kris was before we, the player, entered the picture. What's fascinating is how different Kris feels now. Even when we're controlling them, very little of what mischievous personality comes through on its own. Whether that's because of everything they've experienced, the trauma they've gone through, or simply because of our presence as a player, Kris has become a quieter and far more reserved person than everyone remembers. And that's exactly why Noelle's perspective matters. She remembers a version of Kris that almost nobody else gets to see anymore. Her memories reveal that their bond wasn't superficial, they genuinely knew each other on a personal level. That contrast makes their present-day interactions feel even more significant. Kris is capable of reacting naturally around Susie now, joking around her and expressing themselves in ways they rarely do with anyone else. But when it comes to Noelle, there's a noticeable distance between them. But why? There's no reason for them to. Just like I thought about how Kris feels about Rouse, do I believe Kris has any feelings towards Noelle? Before I get into that though, I want to revisit something that in my last analysis that I wasn't really able to have a chance to talk about. Credit to Dumbalake6001. Yeah, I think I said that right. Because it genuinely made me rethink how I view Deltarune's dialogue choices. Previously, I argued that a lot of the dialogue options we choose don't necessarily reflect what Kris wants to say. I still think that's true to some extent, but I don't think the choices themselves are completely random anymore. Instead, what I think they're probably rooted somewhere in Kris's own subconscious. Some dialogue options might be things Kris genuinely wants to say, while others could simply be passing thoughts, impulses, or even intrusive ideas that crosses their mind. We as the player are the ones deciding which of those thoughts actually become reality. It also changes how I view some of the lighter dialogue throughout the game. Looking back, I think I was a little too dismissive of the idea that some of Kris's dialogue options could reflect genuine feelings, especially of what I said about Rouse, which I will be doing a video about one day. That doesn't necessarily mean every flirtatious option represents exactly how Kris feels or that every choice is entirely their own, but I also don't think it's completely fair to write those off as moments anymore. Kris clearly has some degree of agency in how they express themselves, even if we don't push them toward a particular choice. But why am I bringing this up? Well, because looking at the dialogue this way opens an entirely different perspective on the narrative, especially when it comes to the options involving Noelle. I want to approach the subject, like I said before, with a lot of sensitivity. No matter how we interpret it, every decision we make in the weird route is still our responsibility. We are the ones choosing to push things further. We are the monster behind those actions. Outside of this, the game repeatedly gives us opportunities to choose Noelle to pursue dialogue that can come across as intimate, or even slightly romantic. I don't think that necessarily strips Kris of their autonomy. If anything, it raises the possibility that some of those options originate from feelings that maybe Kris might have had, even if they're passive or in their subconscious, or something they never act upon, of course. Whether those feelings were strong before we entered the picture is impossible to say, but I find the idea fascinating because, regardless of how people personally headcanon Kris, those undertones are still present in the game. Of course, you could probably make the same argument against Rouse or Susie as well. What reinforces this idea for me, however, is that the weird route changes our role as a player. The route doesn't just let us make bad decisions, it forces us to commit to very specific ones. It makes me wonder whether some of those dialogue choices represent the darkest impulse or intrusive thoughts Kris would have never willingly acted upon by themselves. I don't believe the game is telling us Kris secretly wanted to manipulate or control Noelle. There's no evidence that they would ever treat her that way before the events of the game, but I do think it raised the uncomfortable possibility that Kris may have experienced intrusive thoughts about taking advantage of Noelle that they would never act upon themselves. And that's an important distinction. Having a thought isn't the same as endorsing it, and it certainly isn't the same as acting on it. They still have their own values, and everything we know about them suggests that they would never willingly cross that line. The horror of this route is that we take those darkest possibilities and force them into reality. It doesn't reveal Kris's true character so much as it weaponizes the parts of their mind that should have remained just thoughts. In Chapter 3, Irem directly confronts Kris about their weird route in Chapter 2, forcing them to acknowledge that part of them enjoyed it, even if they really despised it. Kinda exposed the darkest, most taboo parts of Kris that never willingly they would act upon. But let's go back to what I said earlier. Why is it specifically Noelle? The player can't just invent dialogue or choose whatever we want, we're limited to the options the game presents to us. So why is it that out of everyone, Noelle is the character that the game repeatedly allows us to pursue? Again, I'm not placing the blame on Kris, my point is that it's strange how these underlying thoughts can completely change the direction of the story, and yet they're almost exclusively centered around her. Yes, there's an obvious gameplay reason for it, but it's not too far-fetched to open our minds a little. If anything, their distance tells me that they care more than they let on. One of the biggest things Chapter 5 made me realize that Kris has gone out of their way to keep Noelle away from the Dark Worlds for as long as possible. That isn't the behavior of someone who's indifferent. If anything, it suggests that the exact opposite, that Kris sees Noelle as someone worth protecting. And if Kris already knows or even suspects Noelle's importance to the prophecy, then their distance starts to make a lot of sense. Maybe they're trying to keep her out of something they know is far bigger than either of them. Kris's actions don't read as apathy, they read as restraint, maybe even repression or avoidance. And yet, from Noelle's perspective, that's exactly how it looks. She mistakes their distance for indifference because that's the only side of Kris she's been allowed to see. Now let's try to analyze her herself. We've already established that she constantly reminisces about her childhood with Kris and clearly misses the relationship they once had. But can we actually interpret that as anything more? At this point, I know I'm stepping into speculation and that this isn't the main goal of the video. I'm trying to keep this as grounded as possible. One of the things that immediately stands out to me is that of their Dark World designs. Kris is portrayed almost like a knight in shining armor, while Noelle wears a flowing white clothing that resembles of a princess, a damsel, or even bridal attire depending on how you interpret it. Others have also connected her design to angelic symbolism. It's hard to ignore how deliberately complementary their designs feel. This would also fit in with Kris, who also used to wear horns back then to fit with her family, replicating a devil and angel relationship, very forbidden and taboo. Then there are the Thorn Ring and the Freeze Ring, both which carry their own uncomfortable implications within the Weird Root, which again is associated with bridal and romantic undertones for a maiden. When Kris recalls a memory when Susie and Noelle are riding the Ferris wheel together, one of their fondest ones was when he remembered Toriel pulling onto Asgore's ear, where then Carol then was pulling onto Rudy's ear, starting a chain of events with specifically all the couples in the family, where then Noelle decides to gently hold on Kris's ear instead, in a kind manner. On their own, none of these details prove anything, but when you start putting them together, a pattern emerges. And then there's the prophecy. The girl in the prophecy points toward is almost certainly Noelle. Her panel is centered around love, finding its way to the girl, while Kris's panel represented by a heart in a cage. It's another one of those details that's difficult to dismiss as a coincidence. Love finds its way to the girl, the love being represented as a heart. Then, when we look at the Weird Root, it almost feels like a twisted reflection of what the prophecy was supposed to become. A version where the bond between Kris and Noelle is distorted into a forced relationship of love. I also interpret this another way, and it's if Kris was shutting down their feelings, just like we see in the game. The heart is a symbolic representation of the love being sealed away into a cage, but Noelle eventually finds her way through that love. If that's true, it could explain why Kris has been trying to keep Noelle away from the Dark Worlds altogether. And there's one last thing that keeps nagging at me. Why does Deltarune lean so heavily in this dynamic of the quiet childhood friend and the girl next door you've known your entire life? It's one of the oldest relationship archetypes in the book. It's a trope that's almost used because of the emotional weight it carries, because it creates a bond that feels deeper than ordinary friendship. So honestly, even without spending time with their relationship, it honestly feels like they have more chemistry. Don't get me wrong, I like Susie and Noelle. I think they're genuinely a cute pairing. The whole dynamic is charming and it's easy to see why so many people root for them, and why the game is rooting for them too. But I also can't blame people who feel like the chemistry develops very quickly, especially considering they've only known each other for about a week. A lot of that relationship starts to bloom in chapter 4 to 5. Compare that to Kris and Noelle. They have years of too much history together. That's a relationship with layers. It creates unresolved emotions and internal conflict. And hell, Susie even thought they were even a couple at first. When I look at Noelle's feelings for Susie, I see someone she admires. Susie represents the confidence and freedoms and everything Noelle wishes she could be. In a way, Susie embodies the life Noelle wants to live. That's why the part of her crush feels so genuine. But at the same time, I don't think that completely erases what Kris means to her. Especially since Noelle doesn't even realize on how similar Kris is towards the people she admires. Noelle's attention is almost entirely focused on fantasizing about Susie, and it makes me wonder if that's because there was once a time where she had feelings for Kris, but eventually convinced herself that they were never going to be returned. Look at the way Noelle talks about Kris whenever you choose dialogue options that compliment her or make her feel noticed. She reacts as if it's completely out of character for Kris to say something like that, rather than considering that Kris might have actually cared. And again, this isn't me saying that Susie and Noelle's relationship is underdeveloped. I actually think it's strengthened a lot throughout chapter 4 and 5. My point is that Kris and Noelle's relationship has also grown, just in a completely different way, and I don't think we should just ignore that. I want to bring this up because I've seen a lot of people deny how Kris and Noelle could even be compatible, and Weird Root proves how unhealthy it is. However you interpret their bond, they don't want the outcome of the Weird Root. It hurts both of them. It forces them to confront one another in the most unhealthy way imaginable. We feed Noelle more fear, we force Kris into becoming more possessive, even if that isn't who they truly are. And instead of allowing Noelle to either fall in love with Kris naturally or rebuild their friendship, we twist that relationship into something built entirely on dependence. To me, symbolically, it represents the forced heterosexual narrative, one built on control and expectation. It stands on direct contrast to the healthier, more natural queer relationship the game presents with Susie and Noelle, one that grows through trust and freedom. So, do I really think Kris and Noelle could work as a relationship? Honestly, yeah, I do. You don't have to ship Kriselle, but I also don't think it's fair to criticize people simply because they see something meaningful in their relationship. The game has given us plenty of reasons to see their bond, even outside our influence. I definitely plan on covering as much of Deltarune as I can if my motivation keeps coming up. I know this isn't exactly the video a lot of you guys were expecting, especially since I've seen a lot of them, especially vote for the Curdly one. I definitely want to see and make that one. The only problem is that as someone who's not a Curdly fan myself, I'm honestly not sure where I'd even begin with the amount of evidence we currently have being so small. And if there's any evidence or details or even a place you think I could start looking for, let me know in the comments down below. And if there's any other ideas you want to see, please also do that. I'd also love to make more videos focused on specific character relationships after all. With that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to reach for the stars.